Megan had always been adventurous, the kind of woman who thrived on spontaneity and excitement. It was one of the many things that drew me to her years ago when we first met. She had a magnetic energy that could turn the most mundane day into an unforgettable memory. I had grown to rely on that spark, even as the routines of marriage dimmed its intensity. When Megan suggested a weekend trip to the Springwood Music Festival, I didn't think twice about encouraging her to go. It was an annual tradition she shared with her best friend, Liz, and while I joined them in the past, this year I opted out. Work had piled up, and I figured Megan could use the time to unwind. She left on a Friday morning, her car packed with camping gear and her mood as bright as the spring sun. As she kissed me goodbye, I felt a twinge of guilt for not joining her. She told me not to worry, said she'd bring back stories of the festival, and promised to call me every evening. The first night, she texted me photos of the sprawling festival grounds. Crowds gathered near the stages, lanterns lit up the night, and the energy of the event practically buzzed through the screen. She mentioned the bands they'd seen and how Liz had managed to snag front-row spots for one of their favorite acts. By Saturday afternoon, the updates became less frequent. I told myself it was because she was caught up in the experience. She sent a quick message saying the reception was spotty but assured me everything was great. I didn't press her. There was no reason to. Sunday evening, I waited for her to come home. The house felt oddly quiet without her, and I busied myself cleaning up, thinking about how we'd spend the week ahead. But as the hours ticked by, the unease I couldn't explain began to grow. Megan finally pulled into the driveway just before midnight. Her car was dusty, her hair tied back loosely, and her eyes looked heavier than usual. She was tired, she said, from the drive and the festival chaos. I kissed her and told her to get some rest, but as she walked past me into the house, I noticed something odd. The faint scent of cologne on her jacket. It wasn't hers, and it wasn't mine. I told myself it was nothing. Festivals were crowded, chaotic places. Someone could have bumped into her or hugged her goodbye. It didn't mean anything. The next morning, Megan was her usual self, chatting about the music, the food stalls, and the quirky performers she'd seen. As the week went on, little details began to bother me. Megan seemed preoccupied, her gaze distant during our conversations. When I asked her about the festival, her answers felt oddly vague, as though she was leaving something out. One night, I found her unpacking her festival bag. Tucked inside was a folded flyer for a local hiking trail, one I knew wasn't near the festival grounds. I asked her about it, and she shrugged, saying Liz had insisted on a short detour before they left. Her explanation was plausible, but it didn't sit right with me. Megan wasn't a hiker, and Liz was the type to stick to the itinerary. The flyer felt like an artifact from a story I wasn't part of, a piece of a weekend I thought I understood. I pushed the thought aside, telling myself I was overanalyzing things. Megan was my wife, the woman I trusted more than anyone in the world. If something was bothering her, she would tell me, wouldn't she? But the unease lingered, a whisper I couldn't ignore. The festival weekend had come and gone, but it left behind a shadow I couldn't explain, and I had no idea how much darker that shadow would become. The unease from Megan's return lingered in the air, like a storm waiting to break. I tried to shake it off, convincing myself it was nothing more than paranoia. But as the days passed, that whisper of doubt grew louder, and I found myself scrutinizing details I would have overlooked before. It started with a scarf. I was cleaning out the car one evening, something I often did after Megan's trips. Beneath the passenger seat, I found a scarf I didn't recognize. It was delicate, made of soft fabric with a pattern of swirling blues and greens. Megan wasn't much for accessories, and this scarf didn't match her style. I pulled it out, puzzled, and took it inside. When I showed it to her, she barely glanced at it. She said it was probably Liz's, left behind after the festival. Her tone was casual, dismissive, and she quickly moved on to another subject. But something about her response felt off, too quick, as though she didn't want me lingering on the topic. I decided to call Liz the next day, framing the question as a friendly check-in. Liz was cheerful as always, talking about how much fun they'd had at the festival. But when I mentioned the scarf, her tone shifted. She said it wasn't hers, and added that she didn't remember Megan wearing one like that. I didn't press her further, but the knot in my stomach tightened. If the scarf wasn't Megan's or Liz's, whose was it? A week later, Megan seemed to settle back into her routine, but small changes in her behavior stood out to me. She began spending more time outside, claiming she needed fresh air to clear her mind. She started taking long walks in the evenings, something she'd never done before. When I offered to join her, she smiled but said she preferred the solitude. One night, I followed her. She left just after dinner, slipping on her sneakers and grabbing her jacket. I gave her a head start, waiting until she was a block away before quietly stepping out to trail her. She walked briskly, her posture tense, as though she were on her way to something specific. I kept my distance, staying in the shadows of the quiet suburban streets. She didn't follow a predictable path, weaving through side streets and doubling back more than once. It was almost as if she were trying to make sure she wasn't being followed. Finally, she turned into a small park on the edge of town. I hung back, watching from behind a cluster of trees as she approached a bench near the edge of the walking path. The area was empty except for a single figure sitting on the bench, his back to me. A man. Megan hesitated for a moment, glancing over her shoulder before sitting down beside him. They didn't embrace or touch, but the way she leaned toward him, her body language open and familiar, sent a jolt of dread through me. I couldn't hear their conversation from where I stood, but I didn't need to. The connection between them was clear in the way they spoke, their heads tilted toward each other like conspirators sharing a secret. After a few minutes, Megan handed him something, a small package wrapped in brown paper. He nodded, tucking it into his coat before standing. They exchanged a few more words before he walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the park. Megan sat there for a moment, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, before standing and heading back the way she'd come. I waited until she was out of sight before stepping out from my hiding spot. On the bench where they'd been sitting, I found the faint remains of a cigarette, still smoldering slightly. Megan didn't smoke. The walk back to the house was a blur, my thoughts racing. Who was the man? What had Megan given him? And why was she meeting him in secret? When I returned home, she was in the living room, flipping through a magazine as if nothing had happened. She glanced up when I walked in, smiling softly, and asked if I wanted tea. I forced a smile in return, nodding, but my mind was miles away. That night, as I lay awake beside her, the pieces of the past week began to fit together in a way I didn't want to believe. The scarf, the hiking flyer, the distant look in her eyes. None of it was innocent. Megan was hiding something, and it was only a matter of time before I uncovered what it was. The following days were heavy with silence, though Megan didn't seem to notice. She moved through the house with an ease that made me question everything I'd seen. How could she appear so normal, so calm, when I could still picture her in the park with that man? I couldn't confront her, not yet. I needed more. What was the package she had given him? Who was he? And how far did her deception go? It didn't take long for the first clue to arrive. On Thursday morning, after Megan left for work, I noticed her laptop sitting on the dining table. She usually kept it in her bag, but in her rush, she must have forgotten it. I wasn't proud of what I was about to do, but I had to know. I opened the laptop, relieved to find it unlocked, and began scrolling through her recent activity. At first, nothing stood out, emails with colleagues, a few online purchases. But then I noticed an unfamiliar email address in her sent folder. The subject line of the most recent email was vague, confirmation. I clicked on it, my heart pounding. The message was short, almost clinical. It's ready. I'll leave it in the usual place tomorrow. There was no name, no indication of who it was meant for. I checked the other emails sent to the same address, but they were all similar, brief, cryptic, and carefully worded. I leaned back in my chair, the weight of the discovery sinking in. This wasn't a random encounter in the park. Megan was coordinating something, and she had gone to great lengths to keep it hidden from me. That evening, I couldn't stop watching her. Every gesture, every word she spoke felt calculated, though I couldn't be sure if it was my own paranoia coloring everything. When she said she was going for another walk, I offered to come along. Her hesitation was brief but telling. She gave me a tight smile, saying she needed some time to think. Once she left, I grabbed my coat and followed her again, staying farther behind this time. She followed the same winding route as before, leading me to the same park. But this time, she didn't meet anyone. Instead, she walked to the bench, crouched down, and placed a small bag beneath it. The act was so quick and subtle that anyone else might have missed it. I waited until she was out of sight before approaching the bench. The bag she had left behind was small, made of plain black fabric, and tied shut with a drawstring. I hesitated for a moment, then picked it up and untied it. Inside was a stack of cash, neatly bound with rubber bands. I stared at the money, my mind racing. Megan and I didn't carry cash like this. Our finances were electronic, every penny accounted for. This was deliberate, calculated. I tied the bag shut and put it back where I'd found it, making sure it looked untouched. Then I walked home, my hands trembling. When Megan returned, she was quiet, her expression thoughtful. She asked about my day, her tone casual, but I could feel the tension beneath it. She excused herself to take a shower, and I stayed in the living room, pretending to read while my mind replayed the scene in the park. That night, I barely slept. The cash wasn't just suspicious, it was dangerous. Was she paying someone? Laundering money? The possibilities were endless, and none of them made sense. The next day, I left work early, unable to focus on anything but the growing mystery. I drove to the park and parked my car far enough away to avoid drawing attention. I waited for hours, watching from a distance as people passed through the park. Finally, just as the sun began to set, a man approached the bench. It was him, the same man Megan had met before. He looked around cautiously before crouching to retrieve the bag. I snapped photos with my phone, my pulse racing. As he walked away, I followed him, keeping my distance. He didn't go far, just a few blocks to an old brick building with a faded sign that read, "Storage and Supplies." He entered through a side door, and I waited outside, debating whether to follow. Before I could decide, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Megan. "Running late tonight. Don't wait up." The knot in my stomach tightened. The timing wasn't a coincidence. This was bigger than I had imagined. Megan wasn't just hiding something. She was actively involved in something secretive, something dangerous. And whatever it was only a matter of time before it came crashing down. The discovery of the cash left me restless, the weight of my suspicions growing heavier with each passing day. Megan's secrecy wasn't just about money. It couldn't be. The cryptic messages, the meetings in the park, and now this man's involvement. It all pointed to something deeper, something far more personal. I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a random scheme or a business deal. The way she carried herself lately, the nervous energy behind her smiles, the way she avoided prolonged eye contact, it felt more personal. It felt like betrayal. That Saturday, Megan said she was heading out to meet Liz for brunch. She kissed me lightly on the cheek, the scent of her perfume lingering as she left. But instead of relaxing into my morning, I waited. 10 minutes after she pulled out of the driveway, I grabbed my keys and followed her. I kept a safe distance, my hands gripping the steering wheel as I trailed her car through town. She didn't head to Liz's neighborhood or the trendy cafe they usually frequented. Instead, she drove toward the outskirts of the city, her route purposeful and familiar. Eventually, she turned into the parking lot of a modest motel, its sign flickering faintly in the daylight. My stomach churned as I pulled into a spot at a distance, my heart pounding as I watched her park and get out of the car. She wasn't alone for long. A moment later, the man from the park emerged from one of the motel rooms. He walked toward her with a casual familiarity, his posture confident. Megan smiled at him, a soft, warm smile I hadn't seen in months. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the car. My pulse raced as I watched them exchange a few words before heading inside together. The door closed behind them, leaving me staring at the beige walls of the room where my wife had just disappeared. I couldn't move. Part of me wanted to burst through that door, to demand answers, to confront her and this stranger about what I already knew in my gut. But another part of me, the part paralyzed by disbelief, kept me rooted to the seat. Minutes turned into an hour. Every second felt like a blow, a reminder of what was happening on the other side of that door. When Megan finally emerged, her hair slightly disheveled and her jacket slung over her arm, it was as if she had stepped into a different world, one where I wasn't waiting, where I didn't exist. The man followed her out, his hand brushing against her back in a way that made my chest tighten. They stood by her car for a moment, exchanging quiet words. Then he leaned in, his hand cupping her face as he kissed her. It wasn't just a kiss. It was the kind of kiss that spoke of familiarity, of passion, of a connection deeper than words. I turned away, my breath shallow and my vision blurred. The image was burned into my mind, a permanent scar I couldn't erase. By the time I looked back, Megan was getting into her car, her expression calm and unhurried. She pulled out of the lot, leaving the man standing there, his hands in his pockets as he watched her drive away. I waited until he disappeared back into the motel before starting my car. My hands shook as I gripped the wheel, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to ask but couldn't ignore. Who was he? How long had this been going on? And how could she do this? To me, to us, to the life we'd built together. Back home, Megan returned a few hours later, carrying a bag of takeout and acting as though nothing had happened. She asked about my day, her voice light, her demeanor effortless. I felt like I was staring at a stranger. I didn't confront her, not yet. I needed time to process what I'd seen, to decide what came next. But one thing was clear. Whatever was left of our marriage had just been shattered. The morning felt heavy as I sat in the kitchen, waiting for Megan to come downstairs. The images from the motel burned in my mind. Her with another man, her lover. It wasn't just the betrayal that gutted me. It was the ease with which she lied and carried on as if nothing was wrong. When Megan finally appeared, her usual cheerfulness felt like a slap. She greeted me casually, but her tone was off, like she was rushing through the motions. I told her we needed to talk, my voice cold and sharp. She froze for a moment, her expression shifting. She asked what was wrong, her tone cautious now, but there was an edge of annoyance in it. I didn't waste words. I pulled out my phone, slid it across the table, and told her to look at the photos. Her eyes flickered to the screen, and for a moment, I thought I saw panic. But instead of guilt or remorse, her expression hardened. She pushed the phone back, her face twisting with defiance. She said she didn't know what I expected from her. What was the big deal? The words hit me like a punch, but she wasn't finished. Her voice rose, dripping with venom as she accused me of being a boring, inattentive husband. She said that for years, she'd felt invisible, trapped in a marriage with someone who cared more about routine than passion. Her insults came fast and sharp, each one cutting deeper than the last. She called me a pathetic excuse for a man, one who couldn't satisfy her in any way that mattered. She said I had no idea what it meant to be a real partner, that I'd lost her long before her lover came into the picture. Her words were brutal, vulgar, each one delivered with a cruelty that left no room for misunderstanding. She said that her lover made her feel alive, like a woman again, something I'd failed to do in years. She sneered at me, saying it wasn't her fault if I couldn't keep up, if I wasn't enough to hold her attention. I tried to speak, to demand an explanation, but she didn't let me. She cut me off with a mocking laugh, calling me pathetic for sitting there like some heartbroken fool. She said she didn't owe me anything, that I should have seen this coming if I'd been paying attention. Every word she said felt like a dagger, deliberate and meant to hurt. She stood over me, her arms crossed, her eyes filled with disdain. She told me I was too predictable, too weak to ever hold on to someone like her. That her lover, unlike me, knew how to make her feel wanted. The room spun as her insults rained down, her cruelty laying waste to whatever scraps of love I'd thought were left. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stood, my hands clenched at my sides, and told her I was done. I wasn't going to sit there and let her rip apart everything we'd built with such vile contempt. She rolled her eyes, waving me off as if I were nothing. She said it was about time I left, that she didn't need someone as useless and pathetic as me holding her back. I grabbed my keys, her words echoing in my ears as I left the house. She didn't try to stop me. Instead, I heard her laughter, bitter, mocking, following me out the door. As I drove away, my mind raced with everything she'd said. It wasn't just betrayal. It wasn't just infidelity. Megan had torn apart our life, spat on everything we'd built, and laughed as she burned it to the ground. I realized then that there was no going back. Not after this. She'd made her choice, and it was clear. I wasn't part of it anymore. The days after I left were a blur of rage and planning. Megan's insults and vulgar words echoed in my mind, each one fueling the fire in my chest. I couldn't stop replaying the scene in the kitchen, her sneering face and mocking tone, the way she dismissed me like I was nothing. But one detail lingered above the rest: the packages. I had almost forgotten about them in the chaos of uncovering her affair, but now they felt like the key to understanding the full extent of her betrayal. Megan had been delivering those small, nondescript packages to the man she was cheating with, her lover, and I had no idea what they contained or why she was doing it. I decided to find out. The next time Megan left the house, I followed her. She didn't seem to notice, her arrogance blinding her to the fact that I was still watching her every move. She drove across town to the park, following the same routine I'd seen before. This time, she carried a small package in her hands, tied neatly with twine. I stayed hidden, watching as she approached the familiar bench. Her lover was already there, leaning casually against the backrest, his posture exuding confidence. She handed him the package without a word, and he tucked it into his jacket, his hand brushing against hers. They exchanged a few quiet words, their faces close enough to make my stomach churn, and then he left. Once he was out of sight, I approached the bench, careful not to draw attention. Megan lingered for a moment before walking back to her car, completely unaware of my presence. I followed the man this time, my heart pounding as I trailed his steps. He walked briskly, heading toward the same storage facility he'd gone to before. This time, I didn't stop at a distance. I waited until he disappeared inside, then crept up to the side of the building. The door he'd used was locked, but luck was on my side. A delivery truck pulled up, and a worker propped the door open as he unloaded boxes. I slipped inside unnoticed, my breath shallow as I followed the sound of footsteps down the hall. The man entered a storage unit near the back of the building. I stayed hidden, watching as he opened the package Megan had given him. Inside were stacks of cash, bundled neatly and secured with rubber bands. My chest tightened as I pieced together what was happening. This wasn't just infidelity. It was something far more calculated. Megan and her lover were moving large sums of money, using the park as a drop point. But why? Where was the money coming from? I didn't have the answers yet, but I knew one thing for sure. Megan wasn't just a cheating wife. She was complicit in something bigger, something criminal. That night, I made my move. I returned to the house while Megan was out, knowing she wouldn't expect me to be there. I rifled through her belongings, searching for anything that might explain the cash. It didn't take long to find a small lockbox tucked away in the back of her closet. I pried it open and found more bundles of cash, along with a notebook filled with numbers and dates. At first glance, it looked like an accounting ledger, but the transactions were vague, with no clear source for the income. My anger boiled over as I realized the truth. Megan and her lover weren't just hiding an affair. They were running some kind of operation together, and they'd likely stolen the money they were moving. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was calculated, deliberate, and it had left me humiliated and furious. The next time Megan met her lover at the park, I was ready. I waited until she handed him the package, then stepped out from my hiding place. The look of shock on her face was satisfying, her confident demeanor crumbling as she stammered, trying to explain. Her lover, on the other hand, simply smirked, his arrogance infuriating. I didn't give him a chance to say much. I let my fist do the talking, landing a punch squarely on his jaw that sent him sprawling to the ground. Megan screamed, her voice shrill as she tried to pull me back, but I was done playing the fool. Megan's face turned pale, her mask of confidence gone. She cursed at me, her words venomous, but I didn't care. I told her this was over. Later that night, I contacted the authorities. I handed over the ledger and the cash I'd taken from the storage unit, knowing it was the only way to put an end to whatever operation they were running. When the investigation began, Megan tried to contact me, pleading for help. She swore she hadn't known what she was getting into, that she'd been manipulated. But her words fell on deaf ears. She had made her choices, and now she would face the consequences alone. For the first time in months, I felt free. Megan's betrayal had been devastating, But watching her lies crumble under the weight of her own actions was a strange kind of justice. She had treated me like I was nothing, but in the end, it was her own arrogance that destroyed her. And for that, I felt no pity. The fallout from Megan's actions came swiftly. The authorities moved in, unraveling the operation she and her lover had been running. The stolen money, the packages, the secret accounts, it all painted a damning picture. Megan tried to downplay her involvement, claiming she had been coerced, but the evidence was overwhelming. Her lover didn't fare any better. When the investigation linked him to multiple fraudulent schemes, he folded under pressure, dragging Megan further down in his attempt to save himself. I kept my distance as the legal proceedings unfolded. Megan's calls went unanswered, her messages unread. She begged for my help at first, then resorted to threats, blaming me for her downfall. But her words carried no weight anymore. She had burned every bridge, and I wasn't going to let her pull me back into the chaos. One day, I drove past the house we had shared, now empty and lifeless. The memories of our life together felt like a distant dream, blurred and insignificant compared to the reality of her betrayal. It was strange how easily love could turn into something unrecognizable. I thought about everything she had said during our final confrontation, the insults, the venom, the way she had dismissed me as if I were nothing. In the end, her words had reflected more about her than me. She had destroyed herself, consumed by greed, arrogance, and lies. And while the pain of her betrayal lingered, I no longer carried the weight of it. Months later, I found myself standing on the edge of a quiet lake, the cool breeze stirring the water into gentle ripples. It was a place I had stumbled upon during one of my drives to clear my head, far removed from the noise and chaos of the past year. As I stood there, I realized how far I had come. Megan's betrayal had been a turning point, but it hadn't defined me. The anger, the grief, the humiliation. I had faced it all and come out stronger. Walking away from her wasn't just about escaping her lies. It was about reclaiming myself. I took one last look at the lake, the setting sun casting its light across the water, and felt a strange sense of peace. The scars were still there, but they no longer defined me. For the first time in what felt like forever, I was free. And that was enough.